Good Friday. It is a day that is memorialized as one of the saddest days in all of human history. The day that we remember the death of Christ. This was a day that would change the world forever. And Jesus took an amazing journey to get to this day. It was a journey that appeared to be 33 years in the making. That was his time on earth. But in reality, the journey started long before that. It started when there was no time, when there was no space, when there was no world and there was no creation. It started in the infinite and eternal mind of the Trinity, when it was determined by God that he would create and redeem and would send his Son to pay the price of that redemption. The road to Golgotha didn't really begin in Bethlehem. It began in heaven, when the Son of God, not thinking his equality with God something to be grasped and held on to, abandoned it, gave it up, and came into this world. It all began in the councils of the Trinity, and in a flash, on a day that we celebrate as Christmas, the Son of God traversed the space between infinity and a finite world, between eternity and time, between the uncreated and the created realm. And now, it was time for his last few steps. This earthly part of Christ's journey was coming to an end. Blood streamed down his face. Massive thorns stuck to the head of our Maker. Groans of agony came from the mouth of him who spoke the world into being. The soldiers beat him. They flogged him. They tortured him. As he inched through the streets of Jerusalem, his cross pressing into his lacerated back, many shuddered at him. The face of God, which Moses could not even look at and live, could no longer even be recognized as human. Women hid their children from the bloody mass of flesh before him. Men taunted him. Soldiers clubbed him. Every prophecy about his suffering was being fulfilled. By judgment and oppression, he was taken away. His sheep scattered when their enemies struck him. One of his own even sold him and betrayed him with a kiss. He found no rest as they beat him, spit on him, and mocked him throughout the night. In the morning, he gave his back to those who struck him, his cheeks to those who plucked his beard. He stepped forward to Calvary as a lamb to the slaughter. This was a sad day indeed. This is a day that oftentimes brings even some of the most emotionless Christians to tears. Personally, I know that I've spent many Good Fridays crying. I remember crying as a special Good Friday. We were doing a special Singspiration and concert at our Christian school. I was a junior. And as we sang song after song about the immense sacrifice that Jesus made, I remember I just couldn't keep it in any longer. I just remember that as I heard each song, that I was just building up with emotion as I thought about what Christ has done for me. And finally, I couldn't hold back tears any longer, and they flooded down my face as I heard everyone around me sing the words, "This the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us. Took the blame, bore the wrath, we stand forgiven at the cross." I remember even further back when I was in 5th grade, a fantastic children's speaker by the name of Ed Dunlop came to our church, and we were having a revival for families and for children, and he was speaking on the crucifixion and what Christ had done. And I remember as he was talking about each thing Christ had endured for us, and he had replicas of each thing that tortured our Savior. And I remember he brought out a crown of thorns and seeing the length of those thorns that were crushed into Jesus' head. I remember how he brought out a whip, the cat of nine tails, and described how they would beat him time after time, and how they would wrap around his body and dig into his flesh and rip it to shreds. I remember when he brought out a spike and a mallet, he would hammer that spike, replicating what they did as they pierced Jesus' hands and pinned him to that wood. I was moved to tears. And many of us on this solemn day, we are moved with emotion and we are brought to tears, much like some people found in Luke chapter 23. We come to this passage and we find Jesus on his way to Golgotha to be crucified. He had been mocked, he had been beaten, couldn't even recognize him. He was whipped until his back was splayed open. Now he is struggling beneath the weight of a rugged wooden cross that rests upon his severely tortured body. And as he is taking his final steps to his last time of breath on this earth, he is surrounded by people. No doubt some of these people mocked and jeered at him. But there were some that responded differently as he completed his earthly journey. And in Luke 23, verse 27, we see it says there, "And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him." As Christ is walking up to his final place on this earth, and we see people all surrounding him, and there are these women there, and they're wailing and they're weeping and they are lamenting Christ. Were these people very close with Christ? Were these people who are extreme followers of Jesus? I don't think so. I think these people here in this passage were professional mourners. And we don't really have professional mourners in our time period here. That's not something that's very common. But in these times, there was people, it was their job, their profession, to go to different places, and where a death had occurred or a tragedy in the family, these people would come and weep and wail and mourn loudly, openly, for the sake of those who are around. And I can't imagine that happening here. People would not really want that. If you didn't know the deceased, they wouldn't really want you coming there and weeping and wailing and making a scene. But that's what these people did. They professionally would go to places and weep and wail. And at this point, most likely, they weren't full of sincerity. I mean, this is their job. It's what they do. And so, and the more you do things, and the less that it plays on your heartstrings. But I can't imagine that these women were completely without sympathy. And they're there and they're wailing and weeping and mourning for Jesus. And yes, it was their profession, and yes, they're used to this, but I can only imagine that some of them had some sympathy as they saw this man in the prime of his life, being innocent of everything he had been accused of, be tortured and being led to his death. And so these women are weeping and wailing for Jesus, but Jesus responds to them a little bit differently than maybe we would think he would respond. Verse 28 says this, "But Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me." His response is one that isn't normal. The only ones in the entire crowd that seemed to be showing some remorse, some sympathy, and care were these women. And Jesus takes the time in the middle of his agony to address them and tell them not to weep for him. He commands them to weep no more. And it seems natural for us as people to want sympathy, doesn't it? And Jesus was being shown sympathy right here. He was being shown a little bit of compassion by people around him. And we as people, we love people to mourn with us. I can remember Facebook posts after Facebook posts where people are fishing for other people to show them sympathy, for other people to weep with them and just to mourn with them and cater to them. And I see post after post of people just hoping for some sympathy from other people, and that they would see how bad and tragic their life is. And we often want that because it's a feeling of comfort when other people sympathize with us. It's a feeling of togetherness, and these people are feeling my pain, and at least they know what I'm going through. But Jesus doesn't have that reaction. In fact, he commands their pity, their sympathy, to completely stop. And what would it be that would make Jesus tell them to stop weeping on his behalf. Possibly it could be that he told them to stop weeping because Jesus was in the midst of saving his people. He was in the middle of saving his people. One author compared the suffering of Christ to a mother giving birth, as the death of Christ, however more painful and severe than giving birth, gave life to all who believe in him. And you can imagine that scene of a woman giving birth and the pain that is there, but there are people surrounding her, doctors and oftentimes the husband, and they are around her, and they are not weeping. They are not showing sympathy. They are not crying because of her pain, but they are excited about the new life that is about to come into the world. Jesus himself even alludes to this illustration in the book of John, chapter 16. Verse 20 says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye shall weep and lament, but the world shall rejoice. And ye shall be sorrowful, but your sorrow shall be turned into joy. A woman, when she is in travail, hath sorrow, because her hour is come. But as soon as she is delivered of the child, she remembereth no more the anguish, for joy that a man is born into the world. And ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again. And your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no man taketh from you." And I can see Jesus telling them not to weep because, in Jesus' mind, this is painful. Yes, this is a terrible act that is happening, but the product of that act is salvation. And he tells them to weep no more. Another possible reason Jesus tells them to weep no more is because he is not a helpless victim in this situation. We hear stories of abuse and rape and murder where individuals are overpowered and are victimized against their will. We cry in outrage when we hear those things. We hear those stories that their innocence is violently taken from them as they could do nothing to oppose their attacker. And yes, Jesus was innocent, but he was the God of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth. Do we honestly think that Christ was a helpless or was a victim to the Jews' hatred and the Roman government? He was in no way helpless. He was in no way overpowered. He could have done anything, and there was no man that could have taken Jesus' life by force unless he willingly gave it up. John 10:15 and 16 says, "As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice. And there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again." Christ commands them not to weep. He says, "Don't pity me. They're not taking my life from me. They're not forcing themselves upon me, but I lay my life down." And he willingly gave himself. Another reason I could see where Jesus commands them to stop weeping is that Sunday was coming. It was Friday at this point and death was imminent, but Sunday was coming. We used to sing a song in choir when I lived in Indiana, and we sang the song, "It's Friday, but Sunday's coming." And the chorus went like this: "It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. The sky is dark, but soon another day is dawning. It's not over yet. King Jesus will prevail. Oh yes, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming." And I remember that song and just the victory that song gave. And we remember the death and the sting of death and the torture and the agony that Jesus had, but we remember he was not going to stay dead. It was Friday. It was a Friday of death and of torture, but Sunday was just around the corner, and Christ knew that. Christ had told his followers, his disciples, multiple times that he would die and rise 3 days later. As painful as the crucifixion was, as horrible as the separation was, Jesus knew that he was victorious, that Sunday was coming. And all these are possible reasons why Jesus said to these women, "Weep not." But Jesus continues speaking, and there are truths that I see here where Jesus commands the women not to mourn for his death because there was something greater that they needed to mourn for. Jesus says, do not weep for me, but you do need to weep for something else. He says there is a greater concern, so don't weep for me. Weep for the greater concern. It says, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Jesus says, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves because judgment is coming. Judgment was specifically coming on the Jewish people. They had rejected their Savior, the one that they were meant to accept and follow, the one who is of David's bloodline, who is the Messiah of Israel. They had rejected. And judgment was coming. Rome was going to persecute the nation like it had never ever seen before. And this actually happened in the year 66 all the way through the year 70 as Jerusalem was completely destroyed and hundreds and thousands of Jews were killed. Jesus says, weep not for me, weep for yourself because judgment is coming on the nation of Israel. But these words that you hear, he says that then shall they begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. These words might sound familiar to you from another passage in Scripture, because we actually find them in Revelation chapter number 6, when God is bringing final judgment on those who have rejected him. And we hear these words, Revelation 6, verse 15, and the king of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rock of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of God. These men who are cowering in Revelation chapter 6, they are facing final judgment. They are facing judgment of a risen king who is coming to take his earthly throne and defeat death and sin for good. And yes, these women were told to weep and mourn for the coming judgment of Israel, but we also see the coming judgment of all who do not accept the sacrifice of Christ. So on this Good Friday, it's a day that, yes, we often become emotional. We often cry and remember the great extent of pain and anguish and torture that Jesus took upon himself. But Jesus says, don't have pity on me, because you need to be weeping for the consequences of sin. And I am guilty of this on many occasions where I am not truly weeping over sin. And to weep over the consequences of sin, have you wept over your sin that nailed Jesus to that cross? Have you wept over the sin that this world is full of, that your children and loved ones of this next generation are going to face? Have you wept over the consequences of sin that those that will not believe on Christ will see when they face eternal judgment? When was the last time you wept over your sin? When was the last time you wept over your personal sin? When was the last time you wept over the sinful world? When was the last time you wept over the consequences many will face because of their sin? On this Good Friday, it is good to weep. It is good to cry. But Jesus does not want our pity. Jesus is victorious. Sunday has come and gone, but we must weep for the consequences of sin. On this Good Friday, it is good to weep. Weep over sin.